Hello, welcome to another incredibly long and tediously boring video. I am actually doing a follow-up video of my earlier review of the Accolade sword of the Knights Templar produced by Windlass Steelcrafts in India. And I'm also testing out a new lapel microphone. The last one I did, the sound kind of sucked. So I'm trying out this new one. We'll see how it goes. So basically this is a follow-up to the original. If you saw that and you had the sound, there were a few complaints that I've been seeing on YouTube from serious collectors, I guess you could say. Let me get up here a little closer. About Windlass Steelcrafts swords. They might be valid points, but I'm going to go through these very quickly. I tend to disagree with them, okay? Now, the first is on the blade itself. Okay, this is not pattern welded steel as would have been used in the 12th and 13th centuries. Forget the myths about pattern welded steel, all right? Pattern welded, folded steel is not superior to a single piece of steel today. Back then it was, simply because the way steel was produced then, bloomery furnaces and such, it was low quality, small amounts, and the only way they could produce a large enough piece of steel to draw out into a sword blade without it breaking was through pattern welding and forging. Now, the problem with pattern welding is it can introduce flaws into the steel. You can get little air bubbles, you can get little pieces of carbon, little inclusions, little micro fractures where the weld wasn't 100%, thorough. And in combat, under extreme vibration, these can cause weak points where the blade can break. Surprisingly, a lot of sword blades made in the medieval period actually did break. Most of the swords found abandoned in moats and rivers and archaeological sites have been broken. All right, now you think about, for one thing, for a moment, the medieval period lasted from, let's say, earliest 700-ish AD up until late 1400s AD. So quite a long time, about, well, let's 700 years. Let's be fair, let's be generous and say 500, be conservative and say 500 years. Okay, it lasted 500 years. It actually lasted almost 700 years, 500 years. Okay, during that period, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of swords must have been made. What we have surviving in museums is only a few hundred, maybe 1,000 or so, taken through all of Europe. I'm not aware of the number, but it's not very many. What happened to all the others? They were broken and discarded, thrown away. That's just the thing with combat. Swords break. They can break. What we have surviving in museums are actually, they were the best of the best. They were real swords, okay? But they were probably never actually used in combat, or if they were used very little. In fact, the sword that's in the British Museum that this one was designed after, the blade itself had been broken and was brazed back together. Now, a steel sword that's been brazed together is not any good for combat. So why would you do that? Well, to keep it as a family heirloom to hang on the wall to display, right? And so it had been repaired just to keep it together. But most of the swords that were broken were just thrown away. Modern steel, and this blade is made from 1065 high carbon steel. It is not the best steel available, but it's good. This thing is made under modern manufacturing processes, computer controlled. The internal molecular structure of this blade all the way down is of a uniform quality that I would say could not have been achieved in the medieval period anywhere. Another, that's my statement. It's my story and I'm sticking to it. The steel in this blade, I believe, is superior to any blade made in the medieval period that an average person could probably afford. So, what are the complaints that I'm hearing on YouTube about this sword? Well, first of all, and it's about windlass steel crafts in general, and I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to get it up here, but you see the edge there? You see that? That is called a secondary bevel. Okay? When a sword is sharpened correctly, the cross section should have one bevel. It should actually look like a wedge. It's a wedge shape. Both sides they taper evenly to the edge, all the way down. A secondary taper is also sometimes called a chisel point, and that's where the blade, if you took a cross section and you're looking at one edge, it comes down and then off to a sharp edge. Instead of going all the way down to a nice, sharp, even edge, it'll come down and then off. And that's what this blade has. And that's this shiny part up here. That's that secondary bevel. Some people seem to get very annoyed at that secondary bevel because the swords in private collections, in museums, typically do not have them. But again, remember, those swords are display swords. They were probably always display swords. If they were ever used in combat, they were probably used very, very little. They're from museums, they're from forts, castles, palaces, private collections. That's why they survived. Now, keeping that single bevel edge is not that easy. When you got little nicks in it that you're trying to sharpen out, it can be kind of difficult. It takes several grades of stone. It takes certain types of tools. It takes the time to be able to sit down and work that edge all the way down nice and even to keep that nice, even, pretty edge geometry. Now imagine you're a knight living in a tent on campaign out in the middle of the desert, okay? You don't have time for that. You've taken a vow of poverty, so you don't have an entourage with you. You got your horse, your tent, you. At the most, you're probably going to have maybe one whetstone, and what you're going to be concerned about more than anything else is putting an edge on this blade, because you could be going into combat against the Saracens anytime, and you want this thing as sharp as you can get it under the conditions you're living in, right? So you sharpen the edge. You get it, take that nick, those little nicks and dents and stuff out as much as you can, and you sharpen that edge down. That gives you this secondary bevel, and that's very common among knives. Almost every knife I own has a secondary bevel. That's just how they're made. Even hollow ground blades, when you get right down to that very tip, it's got a little secondary bevel on it. Traditionally, swords, daggers, katanas, whatever, did not have that, or they're not supposed to have it. But I think if we went back in time to the period, into a war zone, on campaign, I think a lot of the swords that you would actually see people carrying and using probably had a secondary bevel. Okay, they were trying to keep that sword as sharp as they could on campaign when they could be going into combat at any time. If the sword survived, and if they survived and they got back home, back to England or France, wherever they were from, they may have then hired somebody or had one of their people, their servants, take the sword and sit down and work that bevel down again. So it's had a single edge bevel, because that's what it's supposed to have. But I don't think a double-edged bevel is a big deal, because I think in reality, back in the Middle Ages, probably most swords that were actually used, probably if at some point in their life, if not throughout the life of the sword, had a secondary bevel. We don't see that on museum display pieces because the other ones got broken and thrown away. That's my story anyway, and I'm sticking to it. So let's talk about some things about this that I did not mention in my earlier video that Windlass got right. Okay, first of all, the design, as I said before, the overall design matches the design of an actual Templar sword on display in the British Museum. That as far as the length, the width, right? The fullers, the shape of the blade. The fullers extend about 2/3 of the way down the blade. The handle varies from the one on display. The one on display is a straight cross guard. Leather wrapped, which I'm going to show you a little detail of that later. Wheel pommel with some engraving on it. Some engraving, as you can see, on the blade, although this is actually etching, but it's pretty good. I mean, this is a good quality etching. It's deep. You can feel it. That stuff's not going to rub off anytime soon. The one on display in the British Museum actually had engraving in it, and it had some engraving down here near the tip also, which this one obviously doesn't have. But there's a couple other things about this. First of all, if you look at the balance on this thing, the balance is not bad. All right, right in front of the handle. And this is a long blade. This thing's about 40 inches overall, 3 pounds, 10 ounces in weight. It's got a good weight. I mean, it can throw this thing around, right? You can double hand it if you want to. This thing is, you can thrust with it. Thrust, parry, cut. I mean, it's a good sword. It's got a good balance to it. It's got a hefty weight. It's at the high end, actually, of most medieval swords, but it's not unrealistic. A lot of swords, big heavy-duty combat swords, for, you know, a real knight with big, you know, muscular arms and chest, used to swinging these things around. This is a good blade. Here's a point, though, I want to mention. One of the things that they got right. If I hold this, I'm going to back off so you can see this. If I hold this by the pommel and I wiggle it just a little bit, now obviously you can't do it like this, but if you wiggle it, okay, if you can see this, if it wiggle just a little bit, you can see the tip is wiggling, and you can see there's a part up above, that's wiggling. But there's a part of it right in here that's not wiggling so much. It's kind of like a center of what you might call a center, right? What this does is it defines the cutting zone, the part of the blade that wants to cut. Now, if that zone was up here, then obviously this part of the sword is what wants to cut, and you would have to get in close to your opponent. What we want on a sword of this type is we want the part that wants to cut out here. And what it means is when you swing a sword, it's not straight like this. You don't swing it straight like this. You cut with it. You cut. Okay, there's a slicing motion. And it's this part up here that does the cutting, and that's defined or displayed or shown, however you want to use it, by just that little bit of wiggle where you got this zone right in here that's not wiggling so much. Hang on, I got my cables crossed. Now, there's another way you can look at this also. I'm going to hold this like this. Now, if I hold the blade by the guard and I tap the pommel, you see that vibration? Let me get up a little closer. You see how it vibrates? And you can't see the whole thing, but you see it vibrating, right? Again, if you look at this and you watch the vibration, the tip is vibrating, vibrates up, but there's this zone, this position right in here that doesn't really vibrate as much. What that means is everything from here down vibrates, everything from here up vibrates. This part doesn't vibrate so much. This is like the center, you might say, of the sword. So that when you attack and it's guarded, it's usually going to hit right about in there, somewhere in here. The force that the sword receives is delivered directed down to the tip, up to the handle. Another thing to mention, to look at. If I put my thumb right on the bottom tip, right on the bottom edge of that fuller, it works out. Now imagine that I'm going to put my finger on where the top fuller ends. I'm exaggerating this to make a point, but imagine that's where the top fuller ends. You see that space in between those two? That creates a weak spot where the vibration can create waves and back and forth and wobble around. Wobble, if that's a word. It's an engineering term, I just made it up. And that can actually cause a weak point here and cause the blade to break. So if I put my thumb there and my finger, and I'm going to get this as accurate as I can, and you see where the two are? Right there. Right in line. The fullers match. Now I actually measured these with a tape measure, and they were within 2, maybe 3 millimeters of each other. I use a carpenter's, tape measure. It kind of depends on how accurately you want to measure it, but still, a couple of millimeters, that's nothing. That's good. That's a good construction. So the geometry, the design of the blade, and this was the point that I was making in my last video, is correct. The distal taper, which means the thickness here at the base versus the thickness down at the tip, is right. The taper from the base this way to the tip is right. The shape of the tip is right. The pivot point, which determines or defines what part of the blade wants to do the cutting, is right. The vibration, the center vibration, where the vibration from the impact is directed in both directions, is right. They got that part right. This sword is capable of going into a combat situation. Is it the best sword ever made? No. It cost $400, okay? Not $1,400, not $4,000, not $14,000, $400. And it was made in India. So think for a moment about the cost of the materials, the labor to make it, the shipping, the export, the import, the markup between factory and wholesaler, the markup between wholesaler and retailer, shipping to the customer. $400 total. And that includes not just the sword, but it included a nice hand-stitched leather belt, a scabbard wrapped with leather. So this is the kind of sword that a knight from a family on a budget could afford and could go into battle with, and people wouldn't stare at them or think anything odd. Now, another thing about this sword that is right, which I want to mention, again, I had mentioned the guard before. Most Crusader guards had just a straight cross guard, but this curved guard is not uncommon, it's not unusual. And there are even examples of this shape of the guard. So that is historically accurate, not historically common, but historically accurate in that they did exist. The thing I want to mention about the handle, if you'll notice, this is not leather strips wrapped around a wood or plastic filler piece. You can see from this, if you can see it, right there, this is a single piece of leather, okay, wrapped around, edge butted, and then the whole thing is held together with these, let me get up there, twisted dual silver wire wraps, which holds this whole thing together. I like that. That is a nice detail that a lot of sword companies today making budget swords, it's the kind of a detail that they would not go into. They just wrap some leather or even some fake leather, some tape or something around it and call it done. This handle ain't coming off anytime soon, all right? And it grips. I mean, you can grip it. It fits the hand nicely. I've gone into that before, that it's big enough to fit a large hand in a male glove. And with this wheel pommel, you can actually even use it here as a hand and a half sword, even though it's not really a hand and a half sword, but you can use it as one just by grabbing that pommel if you want to. The pommel itself Has some nice engraving work on it. This is the symbol of the Knights Templar, 2 riders on 1 horse on the one side, the 4 points of the cross, which makes it a little uncomfortable to grip, but you know, it's symbolically important. And then on the other side, you have the red cross symbolizing the blood of Christ on the shield. Again, the etching, which is in Latin, which reads in Latin, and forgive my Yankee accent while reading Latin, non nobis Domine, non nobis, sed nomine tuo da gloriam. Nothing for us, Lord, nothing for us, the glory belongs to you. I can see a Knight Templar, you know, having that engraved on his sword, on his blade. Okay, so, things that they got wrong. Okay, let me show you this. I don't know if you can see it or not, but do you see where the guard and the blade, can you see that? Where they meet, you see that gap there? That dark band, that line? Let me turn it over this way. Maybe you can see a little better. You see that gap? That space between the guard and the blade? Okay, if we hold it this way and look, now when you look here, right? There's no gap in here. You see that? You can't see my face through there. There's no gap. The shoulder of the blade sits fully into the guard. That's a good point. But this, if I can see it here, that gap there, that could be a problem over time with multiple impacts that could potentially loosen this up. I'm not going to break this sword just to find out because I like it, okay? I'm going to take it out in the backyard, play with it, slice watermelons. I'm going to bang it on a tree a few times just to see what happens. If somebody wants to send me a free sword to you know, fully test and destroy, I'll be more than happy to do it and give you credit for it, for providing the sword. But I'm not going to. Not on this one, anyway. But yeah, there's some good things about this sword. There's some bad things about it. I don't have the belt with me now. It's up at the house. But the leather working is excellent, clearly hand-stitched. They put the scabbard on mine on the right. I don't know if that was a mistake or not, but I actually like it that way. I mentioned that before, that let me get back here. If I got a shield here in my left hand, it's easier for me to pull my sword out with my right hand than to try and do it this way. It's just easier for me. And the Romans did it that way. The Romans wore their sword on the right for that very reason. That if they got compressed up into battle and got their shield pushed up against them, you couldn't get that sword out. But if it's on your right side, it just comes right out. Very easy, right? Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. So it may have been a mistake on mine, but for me, it was a happy accident. I like it. I wouldn't go back and change it. I am happy with the scabbard being on the right and with the quality of the work. Again, you know, let's don't be too nitpicky, okay? This is a $400 sword, and you can take the attitude of, yeah, man, it's $400 and I want what I paid for, man. Well, guess what? You're getting what you paid for, okay? You didn't pay $4,000, so you're not getting a $4,000 sword. You're getting a $400 sword. Keep that in mind, $400, okay? Materials, labor, manufacturing, shipping, tariffs, markups to the customer from India to America, $400. This is a good deal. This is a good piece of steel. This is not that cheap, whiny 440 or 420 stainless steel that's going to shatter the first time it's hit. 1065 spring steel, hardened it to a Rockwell of 51, which is a good quality steel. Not the best, but good. Good hardness, not the best, but good. Good craftsmanship. Again, maybe not the best, all right, but good. A few problems with it, like that gap there. I don't know if that, like you can see it right there now. I don't know if that would cause any problems in the future or not after some major impacts. Maybe, who knows. But anyway, good pivot point, good. You can see it. Probably can't see it. Good vibration. You can see it when you're standing with the sword and you're, like maybe looking in a mirror and you bang it, you hold it just like this, right? And you just bang it just a little bit and you're in a full length mirror. You can really see that vibration point and the pivot point. It doesn't come off as well in the camera. But anyway, that is my follow-up review of the Accolade sword of the Knights Templar made by Windlass Steelcrafts. Despite their sales blurb about it being the quality of sword that the Grand Master would induct other knights into the order with, no. Okay, the Grand Master, at its height, the Knights Templar was a multi-billion-dollar organization by today's standards, international by today's standards. They wouldn't be carrying this sword. Okay, you will not see the Grand Master of the Knights Templar carrying a $400 sword. Okay, $40,000 sword maybe, not 400. This, however, this is a good, slightly ornate. This gives it a little bit of class, you know, a little cool. The 4 points of the cross, the engraving on the pommel, this gives a little bit of panache, a little bit of class. That wrapping on the handle, that's a little above average for the period. So yeah, and I mean it's balanced. You can swing it. Forgive my lack of skill. I'm not a HEMA expert. I am, in fact, by the way, a retired engineer. So I'm looking at all this stuff from an engineering perspective, not really from personal perspective of fighting in combat. But I'm looking at this construction, the design, as an engineer. And as an engineer, this is a good blade. Not the best, but good. Once again, thank you for watching. And if you're subscribing, tune in again. My next video, I'm going to actually come a little farther forward in time and talk about my latest purchase, which is a black powder firearm. See you then.